I went to the bank to take out a $3,000 loan. The manager turned pale. "Ma'am, look at your balance." She turned the screen toward me. It showed $52 million. When I asked where the money came from, she answered with just 3 words. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I had learned in the 8 months since Mark died that grief has a schedule. It comes at 6 a.m. when the coffee maker gurgles and there's no one to complain that it's too strong. It comes at school pickup when Jacob looks for his father's truck before remembering. And it comes, quietly, every first of the month when I balanced the checkbook and felt the particular fear of a single income trying to do the work of 2. We lived in the same brick colonial in Bexley we'd bought 6 years earlier, the one with the crooked porch step Mark never got around to fixing. I worked part-time as an administrative coordinator at Jacob's school, which gave me summers with him and a salary that covered groceries and not much else. Mark's life insurance had paid off the mortgage, which I was grateful for, but grateful and comfortable are different things, and I had become very familiar with the difference. What I had, besides the house and a 10-year-old boy with his father's stubborn jaw, was family, or what passed for it. Linda, Mark's mother, ran Carter Construction and Development, the company her late husband had built and that Mark had worked for until the day he died. Vanessa, Mark's older sister, handled the books. They had always been present in our lives in a way that felt at first like support, and only later revealed itself as something closer to supervision. It was Linda who insisted on handling Jacob's paperwork after the funeral, the life insurance forms, the small custodial account Mark had opened for his college fund, anything with the Carter family name attached. "You have enough on your plate, honey," she'd say, in that voice that made refusal feel like ingratitude. I let her. I told myself it was kindness. Looking back, I think it was control dressed as kindness, and I was too exhausted to tell the difference. The first uncomfortable thread came in March, when a thin envelope arrived from a law firm in Hartford, Connecticut, a place I had no connection to. It was addressed to Mark, who had been dead for 5 months. Linda happened to be at the house that afternoon, and when I held it up and asked what it might be, she took it from my hand almost before I'd finished the sentence. "Probably some junk mail solicitation," she said, sliding it into her purse. "I'll deal with it." I remember thinking it was an odd thing to volunteer for, junk mail, but I let it go, the way I'd let so many things go that year. Then there was the comment, the one I couldn't quite shake. We were at Linda's house for Sunday dinner, and she'd had 2 glasses of wine, which always loosened the leash on whatever she actually thought of me. "You know," she said, looking at me over her glass, "Jacob is lucky to have us. I don't know what would happen to that boy if it were just you." She smiled when she said it, the way people smile when they want a knife to look like a compliment. Vanessa laughed. I didn't. I started noticing other things after that. Small, easy to dismiss individually. Vanessa referring to the trust once, then catching herself and calling it the college fund instead. Linda's evasiveness whenever I asked, gently, what exactly Mark's father's side of the family had left behind, since Mark had always told me, almost word for word, that his biological father, Robert, had died with nothing and wanted nothing to do with us anyway. I had never had a reason to question that story until I started watching how carefully Linda steered every conversation away from it. By June, our savings had thinned enough that I needed help covering Jacob's orthodontist bill and a summer camp deposit at the same time. And rather than ask Linda, Something in me had started to resist that reflex. I drove to First Heritage Bank to apply for a small personal loan. $3,000. Nothing dramatic. I filled out the form at the little desk across from the manager, a woman named Patricia Lowe who had handled our mortgage years before and always remembered Jacob's name. She typed my information into her terminal, scrolled, and stopped. Her expression changed in a way I'd never seen a bank employee's expression change, the polite professional mask cracking into something like alarm. "Mrs. Carter," she said carefully, "I think you should look at this." She turned the monitor toward me. The balance read $52,418,206.33. I laughed, actually laughed, certain it was a clerical error, a misplaced decimal, someone else's account bleeding into mine. "That can't be right," I said. Patricia didn't laugh. She was already reaching for the phone to call the branch's fraud department, her hand trembling slightly, and when I asked her, half joking, half terrified, where on earth that kind of money could have come from, she looked at me with something close to pity and said the only thing she could say honestly, "I have no idea, but it's real." I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to the empty side of the bed and did the math I always did when I couldn't sleep, except this time the math made no sense. $52 million does not simply appear in the checking account of a part-time school administrator. Money like that has a source, and sources have owners, and owners eventually come looking for what's theirs. My first fear wasn't excitement. It was dread. The specific dread of a woman who has spent her whole adult life being careful, imagining the headlines, "Widow drains bank error, faces fraud charges." I pictured losing the house. I pictured losing Jacob to a system that doesn't care how the mistake happened, only that it happened on my account. Patricia had told me before I left the bank that the funds had been wired in a single transaction 2 days earlier from an entity called the Sinclair Family Trust, administered through a transfer agent in Hartford. She didn't know more than that. Compliance would investigate, she said, and I should absolutely not touch the money until they confirmed where it came from. I promised her I wouldn't. I meant it. I had no intention of spending a cent of money I couldn't explain. The name Sinclair meant nothing to me until I was halfway home, gripping the wheel at a red light, when it landed with the force of a slap. Sinclair. Robert Sinclair. Mark's biological father. The man Linda always described as a deadbeat who'd vanished before Mark turned 5, dead by the time Mark was a teenager, leaving nothing behind but a name Mark rarely used and never wanted. I had taken that story at face value for 12 years of marriage because there had never been a reason not to. Now there was a reason. I didn't go to Linda. That instinct, the one that had always sent me to her for anything official, simply didn't fire this time, and its absence told me something about how much had shifted in 24 hours. Instead, that evening, after Jacob was asleep, I went up to the attic and pulled down the 2 cardboard boxes of Mark's things I hadn't been able to open since the funeral, not out of sentimentality that night, but out of necessity. I needed anything with the name Sinclair on it. It took almost 3 hours sitting on the dusty floor with a flashlight because the attic bulb had burned out, but I found it. A manila folder tucked behind old tax returns, labeled in Mark's handwriting, "Dad's stuff, don't show Mom." Inside was a single letter, yellowed, from a law firm called Whitfield and Marsh, dated the year Mark turned 18, referencing an irrevocable trust established by Robert A. Sinclair for the benefit of his son, with a contact name and a Hartford address. There was also a photograph I'd never seen. Mark, maybe 7 years old, sitting on a man's shoulders at what looked like a lake, both of them laughing. On the back, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Robert and Marky, Lake Winnipesaukee." Mark had known. Mark had known there was a trust, had known his father wasn't the nothing Linda described, and had hidden the folder rather than confront whatever that knowledge would have stirred up in his mother's house. I sat there a long time with that photograph, grieving him in a new and complicated way, not just missing him, but realizing how much weight he must have carried alone, and wondering, with a sick feeling, whether Linda had known he knew. By the time I went to bed, the fear hadn't disappeared, but something else had grown alongside it. If this money was real, and Patricia's reaction told me it was, then somebody had been managing or mismanaging my late husband's inheritance for over 3 decades, and that inheritance, by any law I understood, now belonged to Jacob, which meant somebody had been keeping a 10-year-old boy's birthright a secret. I didn't know yet who or how deep it went. But I knew I needed someone who wasn't part of the Carter family to help me find out, someone with no stake in keeping the Carter version of events intact. The next morning, I called in sick to work, sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and searched Estate Attorney Trust Dispute, Columbus, Ohio, until I found 3 names I didn't recognize from any Carter family dinner. I picked the one whose website mentioned, plainly, we represent beneficiaries, not institutions. My hand shook slightly as I dialed. It was the first decision I'd made in 8 months that belonged entirely to me. Tom Bennett's office was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and secondhand furniture, which somehow made me trust him more than a marble lobby would have. He was maybe 50, unhurried in a way that felt deliberate, and he let me talk for 20 minutes before he said anything beyond, "Go on." When I finished, the bank, the letter, Mark's hidden folder, Linda's decades of "I'll handle it," he set down his pen. "Mrs. Carter, if even half of what you just told me is accurate, your husband may have been the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable trust that someone has been administering or mismanaging for 30 years without your knowledge or his full understanding. And if Mark predeceased the trust's termination date without amending the beneficiary designation, that interest likely passed to his issue, meaning your son." He paused. "I'd like to request the trust documents from Whitfield and Marsh directly, as your attorney, before anyone else gets a chance to shape that story." It took 2 weeks. Whitfield and Marsh, it turned out, had dissolved 11 years earlier, its trust accounts and fiduciary duties absorbed by a regional trust company in Connecticut, which explained the unfamiliar wire and the Hartford address. Tom filed a formal request for the complete trust history, citing Jacob's likely status as remainder beneficiary. While we waited, I tried to act normal. I went to work. I made Jacob's lunches. I said nothing to Linda, which, in retrospect, was its own kind of confession, because Linda noticed. She called me on a Tuesday, her voice doing the thing it did when she was probing rather than chatting. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "Everything all right with you and Jacob?" I told her we were fine, just busy with summer camp registration. There was a pause on her end that lasted half a beat too long. "You'd tell me," she said, "if something was going on. We're family." I said of course, and hated myself a little for how easily the lie came out, and hated her more for making me need one. What I didn't know then was that Linda had her own reasons to be uneasy. Vanessa, I'd later learn, had received a routine compliance inquiry from the same Connecticut trust company. a standard notice sent to any party previously listed as a discretionary co-trustee, informing her that the trust's assets had been distributed to its rightful beneficiary following confirmation of Mark Carter's death and his son's status as sole heir. It was a form letter, nothing accusatory on its face, but to Vanessa, who had spent 15 years quietly drawing trust administration fees that were never reported to Mark or me, it must have read like a verdict. The documents arrived at Tom's office on a Thursday afternoon, and he called me in immediately. Spread across his conference table were 3 decades of trust statements, and what they showed wasn't subtle once you knew what you were looking for. Robert Sinclair had died when Mark was 9, leaving an irrevocable trust funded with roughly $4 million in investment assets, structured to grow untouched until Mark turned 35, or, in the event of his death, to pass to his children. Linda Carter was listed as a named co-trustee with limited discretionary authority she had used repeatedly over 26 years to authorize trustee compensation and administrative disbursements to herself, and later to Vanessa as co-administrator, totaling, by Tom's rough calculation, over $600,000 that should never have left the trust's principal at all. But the disbursements were almost beside the point next to what they confirmed. Linda had known about this trust the entire time. She had signed documents acknowledging it. She had told Mark and later me a story about a father who'd left nothing while quietly collecting fees from the trust he supposedly hadn't left. The market had simply done the rest. 3 decades of compounding had turned $4 million into 52, untouched by anyone who actually had a right to it, while the woman entrusted to protect it had spent a quarter-century pretending it didn't exist. I sat in Tom's office holding a printed statement with Linda's signature on it, dated the year Mark and I got married, and felt something settle inside me that hadn't settled since the funeral. Not anger exactly. Anger would come later. It was clarity. There was no longer any version of this where I could pretend it was a misunderstanding, where Linda could explain it away over Sunday dinner. I had proof, and proof, I was beginning to understand, was the only language this family had ever truly respected. Tom filed the petition the following Monday, a request in probate court to formally confirm Jacob as the trust's remainder beneficiary, to appoint me as his legal guardian and trustee for the inherited funds, and to compel a full accounting of every disbursement Linda had authorized over 26 years. It was a quiet procedural document on paper. In practice, it was a flare sent up over the entire Carter family. Tom had warned me before we filed that this single step would change the temperature of everything, that once Linda was served, there would be no more pretending we were simply sorting out paperwork between family members. Once it's filed, it's official, he said. There's no taking it back to keep the peace. Are you ready for that? I told him I was, though some part of me wasn't entirely sure until the moment it actually happened. Linda was served with notice on a Wednesday. She called me 4 times within an hour. I let it go to voicemail each time, the way Tom had advised, and that silence apparently did more damage than any conversation could have, because by 6 that evening, she and Vanessa were standing on my porch, both of them in coats that suggested they'd left a dinner to come straight there. "You went behind our backs," Linda said the moment I opened the door, before I'd said a word of greeting. Her face had the particular tightness of someone more frightened than furious, though she was working hard to perform the second. "Do you understand what you've done? You've dragged a private family matter into a courtroom. You've made us look like criminals in front of strangers. You are the ones who didn't tell anyone about a trust for 30 years, I said. I kept my voice level, the way I'd promised myself I would. I'm not the one who made it a secret. Vanessa stepped forward then, and her tone was sharper, more surgical than her mother's. You have no idea what you're risking. Jacob's entire relationship with this family, with his grandmother, with his cousins, depends on how this goes. Courts can be unpredictable, Emily. People say things in depositions, things about a mother's mental state since her husband died, her judgment, who she's letting into her house at night. She let that hang there, and I understood, with a cold drop in my stomach, that I was being threatened with a custody fight dressed up as concern. Are you actually saying you'd go after my custody of my own son? I asked. We're saying, Linda cut in, softer now, pivoting, that families don't need lawyers between them. Drop this petition. Let us handle the accounting privately, the way we always have, and none of this needs to go anywhere ugly. We can sit down, the three of us, and sort it out like adults. I thought about the photograph of Mark on his father's shoulders, hidden in an attic for a reason I now understood completely. I thought about the signature on that statement, dated my wedding year. I think, I said, you've been handling it privately for 26 years, and that's exactly the problem. The petition stands. Linda's composure finally cracked, just slightly at the edges. You'll regret this, she said, and there was no performance left in it. Then she turned and walked back to the car, Vanessa following a step behind, throwing one last look back at me that I couldn't quite read. Not quite hatred, something closer to calculation, like a woman recounting numbers in her head. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, my hands not entirely steady, listening to their car pull away. I called Tom before I'd even sat down, my voice clipped and fast as I repeated the custody threat word for word while it was still fresh. He was quiet for a moment, then told me to write it down exactly as I remembered it, time-stamped, and email it to him that night. Threats like that rarely hold up legally on their own, he said, but if this ever does turn into a custody fight, a documented pattern of intimidation timed to the trust filing will work entirely in your favor. Keep a record of everything from here forward. It was strange comfort, being told to prepare for a fight I hadn't asked for, but it steadied me more than reassurance would have. Jacob called down from upstairs asking if Grandma had left already, and I told him yes, and that everything was fine, and felt the particular exhaustion of having just told a true thing and a comforting lie in the same breath. I didn't sleep well that week. By Friday, I'd decided Jacob and I needed distance, even briefly from the house where every doorbell now made my stomach drop. My sister had a cabin 2 hours north, on a lake not unlike the one in Mark's photograph, and I packed a bag for both of us without overthinking it. We spent 3 days there doing nothing, fishing badly, burning marshmallows, sleeping late. My sister Karen didn't push for details the way I half expected her to. She just handed me a second cup of coffee each morning and let me talk when I wanted to, which turned out to be more in those 3 days than I had in the entire previous month combined. Jacob asked once, lying in the hammock, why Grandma and Aunt Vanessa seemed mad at me, and I told him the truth in the smallest version I could manage, that there had been some confusion about money that belonged to him, and I was making sure he got what was rightfully his. He nodded like that made perfect sense, the way children do, and went back to skipping rocks. I envied him that simplicity for the rest of the trip, and on the drive home, watching him sleep against the window, I found myself hoping it would last a little longer than I suspected it would. We'd been back from the lake 4 days when Vanessa called, her voice unrecognizably warm. "I've been thinking," she said, "and I think we got off on the wrong foot. What if we proposed something fair? A settlement, just between us. No courts. $2 million transferred to you directly today if you want it, and you withdraw the petition. Jacob still gets his relationship with the family. You get real money in your hands instead of waiting on a court for who knows how long, and we all move forward. I let the silence sit there long enough that she added, unprompted, $3 million if that helps. When I didn't answer that either, she tried a different register entirely, softer, almost pleading. Mark wouldn't have wanted this, Emily, you know that. He hated conflict. He would have wanted us to find a way to settle this quietly, as a family, not drag his name through a courtroom. It was a strange thing, hearing her invoke Mark's gentleness as a reason to stop pursuing what he'd hidden in an attic folder his whole adult life. I told her I thought she had no idea what Mark would have wanted, since she hadn't known he'd kept his father's letter at all. There was a long pause on the line after that, long enough that I almost thought she'd hung up before she said, "Quieter now. You don't know what you're starting," and ended the call without waiting for a reply. I sat with my phone in my hand for a while afterward, trying to decide whether that last sentence had been a threat or, oddly, something closer to a warning she actually meant kindly. I never did settle on an answer. It was strange, hearing the number climb without my saying anything, like watching someone bid against themselves. A year earlier, $2 million would have sounded like the end of every worry I had. Now it sounded like exactly what it was, an attempt to buy back 26 years of silence at a steep discount on the condition that I stop asking why the silence had existed in the first place. "I'm not interested in a settlement," I told her. "I'm interested in the accounting Tom requested. If there's nothing to hide, that accounting will say so, and this conversation won't matter." She hung up without saying goodbye. I noticed in the weeks that followed that the direct pressure stopped almost entirely. No more porch confrontations, no more late-night calls. Tom said this was typical. People who've been caught usually shift from offense to surveillance, watching for any sign of weakness before they try again from a different angle. It should have unsettled me more than it did, until the afternoon I picked Jacob up from school and recognized Vanessa's silver sedan parked half a block from the entrance, engine running, no obvious reason for her to be there at all. She didn't approach, didn't roll down the window, just watched us cross the lot to my car. I didn't mention it to Jacob. I mentioned it to Tom that same evening, and he simply said calmly, "Document it. Don't engage," which became something of a mantra for that entire stretch of waiting. A week later, a neighbor mentioned, almost in passing, that a woman matching Linda's description had stopped to chat with her at the mailbox and asked, very casually, how Jacob and I had seemed lately, whether we'd had any visitors, whether I'd mentioned moving. I added that to the file Tom was keeping too, even though, taken alone, it sounded almost harmless. What helped most wasn't the calm itself, though. It was not having to hold it alone. I told Rachel Nguyen everything over coffee one Saturday, the friend I'd known since Jacob and her daughter started kindergarten together, and instead of the shocked disbelief I expected, she just said, "Okay, what do you need?" Not a question, a starting point. It turned out Rachel's brother-in-law was a forensic accountant, David Reyes, who specialized in exactly this kind of family trust dispute, and within a week he was reviewing the trust statements alongside Tom, cross-referencing every administrative disbursement against actual market activity, building line by line a picture far more damning than the rough estimate Tom had first sketched. David worked mostly at night, he told me once, apologizing for sending spreadsheet updates at 11 p.m. because his day job kept him too busy to dig through 30 years of brokerage statements during business hours. I never once felt like he was doing me a favor he resented. If anything, he seemed almost energized by how clean the pattern eventually became once enough data was laid side by side. There was something else Rachel gave me that I hadn't known I needed, a name for what I was feeling without a name for it. "You're not being paranoid," she told me, the night I admitted I still flinched every time my phone rang. "You found out the people who were supposed to protect your son's future spent decades quietly stealing from it. Of course you're on edge. That's not weakness, Em. That's a normal response to learning your family isn't who you thought they were." I started slowly to widen the circle further. A single mother's support group that met Tuesday evenings at the community center, mostly widows and divorced women trading practical advice about lawyers and lonely Sundays. I went the first time mostly to do something with the empty evening and stayed because a woman there named Carol, who'd fought her own late husband's family over a business years before, told me something I kept returning to. "They're going to try to make you feel crazy for wanting what's fair. Don't let the volume of their anger convince you that you're the unreasonable one." Another woman in the group, a quieter one named Teresa who rarely spoke, pulled me aside after the second meeting and said only, "Keep every email, keep every voicemail. People like that always think they're too smart to leave a trail, and they almost never are." It was practical advice delivered with the weight of someone who'd learned it the hard way, and I took it seriously. By the fourth meeting, I found myself the one offering advice to a newer woman who'd just learned her late husband's brother was disputing her widow's share of a small family farm, and realized, almost without noticing the shift, that I'd stopped being only the person in the room who needed help. Linda and Vanessa, as far as I could tell, were doing exactly what David and Tom predicted, watching, waiting, gathering whatever they could find to use against me later. I decided I would spend that same waiting period doing something more useful, getting stronger, and getting ready. The invitation came through Jacob, which I understood immediately to be deliberate. Linda called the house phone, not my cell, knowing Jacob might answer, and asked sweetly whether the two of them could have a family dinner that Sunday. Nothing official, she said, just to clear the air before things got out of hand in court. Jacob, who missed his grandmother's cooking and had no idea what court even meant in this context, begged me to go, and I agreed, mostly because Tom thought it would be useful to see what they were planning before the accounting was finalized. He'd told me, half joking, half serious, to just listen more than you talk, which turned out to be easier advice to give than to follow once I was actually sitting at that table again. Linda's dining room looked exactly as it always had. The good china out, a roast in the center of the table, candles she only lit for company. For the first 20 minutes, it really did feel like an old Sunday. Vanessa asking Jacob about camp, Linda fussing over whether he wanted seconds. She'd even pulled out an old photo album before dinner, flipping it open on the side table to a picture of Mark at maybe 16, grinning in a high school baseball uniform, and said, almost wistfully, "I miss him every single day, you know. I just wish this whole mess hadn't happened on top of losing him." I noticed, looking at that album later, that every photograph in it was carefully selected. Mark as a child, as a teenager, as a groom at our wedding, and not a single one from before he turned 9, before Robert Sinclair died, as if that entire chapter of his life had been physically removed along with the story of it. I let myself relax slightly anyway, which I now think was exactly the point. It was over dessert that the mask, as I'd later describe it to Rachel, came off. Linda set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized from a dozen earlier disagreements. the wounded, patient look of a woman about to deliver a verdict disguised as wisdom. Mark would be devastated, she said, to see what's happening to this family. All this fighting over money, lawyers digging through everything, and for what? He'd want his son raised the way we raised him, together, not torn apart by greed. This isn't about greed, I said. It's about a trust your husband's son was entitled to, that you took money from for 26 years. You don't know the sacrifices I made for this family, Linda snapped, the patience gone in an instant. Raising 2 children alone after Robert died, building this company from nothing with Mark's father, and you waltz in 12 years ago and now you want to paint me as some kind of thief because I took what I was owed for decades of work nobody else was doing. Vanessa, more controlled, tried a different angle. She glanced toward Jacob, who was still at the table finishing his pie, and lowered her voice just enough to make it feel conspiratorial rather than direct. Sweetheart, would you be sad if you didn't get to see Grandma anymore? Jacob blinked, confused, and said, of course he would. And Vanessa looked back at me as if she'd just made her entire argument for her. I asked Jacob, as gently as I could, to go wait in the den for a few minutes while the grown-ups talked. And once he was gone, I told Vanessa exactly what I thought of using a 10-year-old as leverage in a room full of adults. She had the decency, at least, to look briefly embarrassed before recovering. Think about Jacob, she said instead, leaning toward me. Think about what it does to a 10-year-old to watch his mother drag his grandmother through court. People talk, Emily. Other parents at his school will hear. Is that really the legacy you want to give him? The boy whose mother sued his own family? It's an interesting argument, I said, coming from the person whose name is on a notarized document that doesn't add up. I hadn't planned to say it that early, but something about watching her use Jacob as a bargaining chip made the patience I'd been holding on to for weeks simply run out. Vanessa's face shifted, just slightly, the practiced warmth giving way for half a second to something tighter and more alert, before she caught herself and asked, too evenly, what exactly I meant by that. I thought of David's spreadsheet, of Linda's signature on documents acknowledging a trust she'd told everyone didn't exist, of the photograph of Mark on his father's shoulders that she'd apparently let him grow up believing never happened. The accounting is finished, I said, quietly enough that both of them went still. David Reyes completed it last week. It documents every disbursement you authorized from that trust since I married Mark, and several years before that. Tom's filing it with the court Monday. The silence that followed had weight to it. Linda's face moved through several expressions before settling on something brittle and cold. You ungrateful, calculating woman, she said, her voice low and shaking. After everything this family did for you. Vanessa stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor, told Jacob with forced brightness that it was probably time to head home, and didn't look at me again as she walked us to the door. In the car, Jacob asked why everyone seemed upset, and I told him grown-ups sometimes disagree about important things, and that it wasn't his job to fix it. He accepted that, the way he'd accepted everything else. With a trust in me I felt almost unworthy of given how unsteady I still felt inside. But underneath the unsteadiness was something sturdier than it had been a month before. They had thrown everything they had at that table. Guilt, threats, Mark's memory itself, even Jacob's own affection, and none of it had moved me. If anything, watching Linda's mask finally slip all the way off had done what nothing else could. It had burned away the last sliver of doubt that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe family loyalty should have counted for more than the truth. It didn't. Not anymore. I called Tom from the driveway before I'd even gone inside, recounting the whole dinner while it was still sharp in my memory, and he told me, with something almost like relief in his voice, that revealing the timeline to them beforehand had been a calculated risk worth taking. Now there would be no claim, later, that the filing had come as some ambush. Whatever happened next, they couldn't say they hadn't been warned. The hearing was held in a probate courtroom that felt smaller than I'd expected, all wood paneling and fluorescent light, with none of the drama television had taught me to imagine. Tom had warned me it would feel anticlimactic right up until it didn't. He was right. Linda and Vanessa arrived with their own attorney, a sharp, unsmiling man named Halloran, who opened by arguing that the disbursements in question were standard trustee compensation, well within Linda's discretionary authority as named co-trustee, and that this entire proceeding was, in his words, a grieving daughter-in-law's attempt to punish a family for imagined slights. I sat very still and let David's exhibits do the talking. The first exhibit was simple. The original 1994 trust instrument, specifying that trustee compensation could not exceed 1% of trust assets annually without written consent from the trust's protector, a role held, it turned out, by Robert Sinclair's own brother, a man named Walter Sinclair, still alive at 78 and living in Maine, whom David had managed to track down 2 weeks earlier. Walter, present by video link, testified plainly that he had never once been consulted about any disbursement, had not known the trust still existed beyond a single notification decades ago, and had certainly never approved compensation totaling what David's analysis showed. Halloran tried to recover, pressing Walter on whether he'd simply forgotten such approvals over 30 years. Walter, unbothered, said he hadn't forgotten anything because there'd been nothing to forget. I'd remember signing documents that gave away $600,000, he said. I don't sign things I don't remember. David followed Walter's testimony with a second exhibit the courtroom hadn't been expecting, a record of a small holding company registered under Vanessa's maiden name that had received 4 separate consulting fee transfers from the trust's brokerage account over a 6-year span, none of which appeared anywhere in the Carter construction books Vanessa had submitted as the company's official financial history. Halloran's objection was overruled before he'd finished raising it. Judge Hargrove simply asked Vanessa directly what services that company had provided in exchange for those fees, and Vanessa, for the first time all morning, had no answer ready at all. Tom had also arranged, almost as an afterthought weeks earlier, for Patricia Lowe from First Heritage Bank to provide a brief written statement confirming the original wire transfer details and the date the funds had posted. A small, almost procedural piece of testimony, but it closed off any argument Halloran might have tried to make later about irregularities in how the transfer itself had occurred. Patricia's statement noted plainly that the trust company in Connecticut had followed standard fiduciary transfer protocol once Jacob's status as confirmed heir was established, which left Halloran with nothing to work with on that front at all. Then came the signatures. David had cross-referenced Vanessa's co-administrator disbursement requests, a role she'd assigned herself only 8 years into the trust's life, with no authorization in the original instrument at all, against bank notarization records from the period. 3 of the 11 notarized requests had been witnessed by a notary, whose license, David had discovered through a simple public record search, had expired 2 years before the date stamped on the document. It was a small thing, almost technical, but it cracked something open. Vanessa's attorney leaned over to whisper something urgent to her, and I watched her face go pale in a way I recognized. The same pale Patricia Lowe's face had gone months earlier, looking at a balance she couldn't explain. The judge, a deliberate woman named Hargrove, who'd said almost nothing for the first hour, finally spoke. "Ms. Carter Hayes," she said to Vanessa directly, "can you explain how a notary witnessed a document 2 years after her license expired?" Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Halloran, who had no answer to give her. Linda, beside her, had stopped performing entirely. She sat with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white, staring at the table like a woman watching 30 years of carefully maintained fiction collapse in real time. At one point, she leaned toward Halloran and whispered something I couldn't hear, and whatever it was made him shake his head slightly, almost imperceptibly, the universal gesture of a lawyer telling a client there was nothing left to say. "I want to be very clear about what I'm seeing," Judge Hargrove said, addressing the room now. "A trust established for a minor child, mismanaged for over 2 decades by a co-trustee who repeatedly authorized compensation to herself and an unauthorized third party without the legally required consent of the trust's protector, using documentation that appears, on its face, to be fraudulent." She looked at Halloran. "I'd encourage your clients to retain criminal counsel separately from this proceeding, because I intend to refer this matter to the county prosecutor's office for review." I didn't feel triumphant sitting there. I felt mostly very still, the stillness of a woman who has spent 4 months bracing for a blow that, when it finally landed on someone else entirely. Linda turned once to look at me across the room, and for the first time in 12 years of knowing her, I saw nothing calculating in her expression at all, just fear, plain and unguarded, the look of someone who has finally run out of moves. The court's written order came down 9 days later, and Tom read it to me over the phone before I'd even gotten home from work, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a lawyer who'd built a case exactly as solidly as he'd intended to. Judge Hargrove confirmed Jacob as sole remainder beneficiary of the Sinclair Family Trust, appointed me as sole trustee with full authority over the now confirmed $52.4 million in assets, and removed Linda Carter as co-trustee permanently with a formal finding of breach of fiduciary duty. She ordered Linda and Vanessa jointly liable for the repayment of over $600,000 in improperly authorized disbursements, with interest, and referred the entire file, as promised, to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for Criminal Review. The consequences moved faster than I expected once they started. Carter Construction's board, 3 members of which were longtime employees, not family, men who'd worked alongside Mark's late father for decades and had no patience for fraud once it had a court order attached to it, voted within 3 weeks to remove Linda as CEO and Vanessa as CFOs, citing the breach finding as cause and citing their own fiduciary obligation to the company's surviving contracts and reputation. A regional paper picked up the story briefly under a headline that made my stomach turn, even though every word in it was true. Local construction matriarch removed amid family trust fraud allegations. Linda, who had spent 30 years being the most respected woman at every Rotary luncheon and Chamber of Commerce dinner in the county, was suddenly the subject of exactly the kind of talk she'd once threatened would ruin me. A neighbor of hers later told my cousin that Linda had stopped attending the Thursday Garden Club altogether after 2 of the longtime members made a point of asking, loudly, within her earshot, whether the rumors in the paper were true. The criminal review took longer, the way these things do, but by autumn, the prosecutor's office had filed charges against both Linda and Vanessa for breach of fiduciary duty, and in Vanessa's case, an additional count related to the falsified notarizations. Their attorney negotiated a plea. Linda would avoid prison through a combination of restitution, probation, and a permanent bar from serving as a fiduciary of any kind for the rest of her life. Vanessa, given the document fraud, accepted a shorter probationary sentence with a felony conviction attached, which I later learned cost her the CPA license she'd held since her 20s. Several of the company's longtime clients, reading about the breach finding in the local paper, quietly declined to renew contracts that were up that year, which Tom said was probably the most lasting financial damage of all, more than the restitution itself. A reputation built over 30 years doesn't survive a fraud finding intact, no matter how the legal proceedings ultimately resolve. The restitution itself, structured over 4 years rather than paid in a lump sum, came with court-ordered financial reporting requirements that Tom said amounted to a second, smaller trial every quarter, a detail Linda apparently found more humiliating than the original judgment, according to the same cousin who occasionally passed along news I hadn't asked for. Other relatives I'd barely spoken to in years, a great aunt on Mark's father's side, a second cousin who'd grown up alongside Mark before Linda remarried, reached out separately once the story became public, several of them confiding that they'd always found Linda's account of Robert Sinclair's death oddly thin on details, though none of them had ever felt it was their place to push. It was strange comfort hearing that I hadn't simply imagined the inconsistencies all those years. Other people had noticed too, quietly, and simply never said anything. I want to say I felt no satisfaction in any of it, that I rose above the urge to feel vindicated, but that would be a lie, and I'd had enough of this family's lies to last a lifetime. I felt the particular unglamorous relief of a fight finally being over, of not having to brace for the next call or the next porch confrontation. There was no settlement, no quiet compromise where everyone saved face and went back to pretending at Sunday dinners. Linda had bet at every turn that family loyalty would eventually outweigh my insistence on the truth, and she had lost that bet completely in a courtroom, with her own brother-in-law testifying against her by video from Maine. Jacob took the news the way 10-year-olds take most things that are too large to fully understand, with a few pointed questions and then a return to whatever he'd been doing before I sat him down. "So Grandma stole my money?" he asked, and when I said, as gently as I could, that yes, that's essentially what happened, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's really messed up," and went back to his video game. I laughed for the first time in weeks, surprised by how exactly right that assessment was. I didn't see Linda again after the plea hearing. She sent one letter, months later, that I read once and didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because I understood, finally and completely, that there was nothing left to discuss. The trust was Jacob's. The truth was out. The fight, the actual fight, was over, and she had lost it without a single concession in her favor. A year later, our life looked almost ordinary. Its own kind of victory after everything. I'd left the school administrator job not because we needed the money anymore, but because I wanted something that felt like mine, and started a small nonprofit with part of the trust, the Mark A. Carter Memorial Fund, which provides emergency assistance to families navigating a parent's sudden death, the kind of financial whiplash I'd lived through myself. We kept the house in Bexley, crooked porch step finally fixed, because Jacob didn't want to leave the neighborhood where his father's memories still lived in the backyard tree and the driveway basketball hoop. Jacob, now 11, had grown steadier than I expected a kid could after a year, like the one he'd had. Fewer questions now, more of a settled trust that things were handled. He'd started asking, on his own, about his grandfather Robert, the real one, and I'd shown him the photograph from the attic, the two of them at the lake, and told him everything I knew. He kept it on his nightstand now, in a frame. Rachel and David had become permanent fixtures in our lives. David helping me set up the Foundation's books properly, Rachel still my Tuesday night coffee, the friend who'd believe me before there was any proof to believe. I'd started seeing someone, slowly, a widower named Paul I'd met through the support group, with the quiet relief of being known by someone who'd never had a stake in the Carter family mythology. Linda and Vanessa's lives, by contrast, had unraveled the way a carefully maintained reputation does once it finally meets its consequences. Carter Construction, under new leadership, distanced itself entirely from the family name within a year, rebranding to avoid the lingering association with fraud. Most of its long-standing municipal contracts didn't survive the transition, and the company that had once employed 40 people now employed 12. Linda, stripped of her board seat, her fiduciary privileges, and most of her social standing, sold the house she'd lived in for 30 years to cover restitution and legal fees, and now lived, according to a cousin who still spoke to me occasionally, in a modest condo across town, mostly alone. Vanessa's marriage didn't survive the felony conviction and the financial collapse that followed. Her husband filed for divorce 8 months after the plea hearing, citing irreconcilable differences that everyone close to the situation understood to mean something closer to "I didn't sign up for this." Without her CPA license, she'd taken a bookkeeping job at a small auto parts distributor, a long professional fall from CFO of a multi-million-dollar construction firm, and according to the same cousin, she rarely mentioned the old company anymore, as if silence might eventually make people forget. I didn't seek out updates on either of them. They came to me anyway, the way news about people you used to love always does, and each time I felt less than I expected to. Not joy, exactly, just a quiet confirmation that the world tends to settle accounts more fairly than it seems to while you're still waiting. Jacob and I were thriving. They were not. I hadn't engineered that outcome out of vengeance. I'd simply told the truth and let the consequences land where they landed. It turned out that was enough.